Hello, I'm Deborah Malone, founder of The Internationalist and host of Internationalist Marketing TV. Today's guest is Robin Bonn, CEO and founder of Definery and author of Market of One. Robin, what a pleasure to see you and on such a wonderful occasion. Books are always fun. So welcome, welcome, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you, Deborah. Yeah, I really appreciate it. It's like you say, it's a big moment, and I'm super thrilled that you've invited me on the show. So thank you.
Oh, you're more than welcome. You're more than welcome. I'm look, hey, who isn't a big fan of books? So let's start with something rather obvious, but I think a nice place to start. The title, Market of One.
Yes.
What does it mean, and why is it such a powerful concept for agencies today?
Yeah. It's obviously a question that comes up when people hear the title. It's sort of intriguing. Hopefully, the subtitle kind of unpacks that a little. But in essence, it's very, very simple. For me, if you are an agency and you're able to create a market of one, effectively you become the leader in a category that is defined by your own uniqueness. So it's really about putting your best qualities, your most ownable qualities forward. So things like experience, your beliefs, your culture, the things that are genuinely unique to your agency, if you look carefully enough, and using those to start to differentiate the business rather than the more generic things like rhetoric or capabilities. And yeah, it's a powerful concept. If you're conscious of being an agency in a sea of sameness, it's a great way out of that. And I think increasingly, if you're an agency that feels as though you are already pretty well differentiated or as differentiated as you can be, it's a good way of thinking perhaps a little bit more deeply about that. So that's really what the book's about. It's just trying to provide that empowerment for agency leaders.
You bring up a number of wonderful points, and I know that we're going to start talking through the uniqueness and the sea of sameness. But just before we get to that, I'm always curious, what motivated you to write this book now? You call it part manifesto and part how-to guide, but was there some insight or some breaking point or something, occurring right now that made you think that the whole agency business needed some sort of a rethink?
It's a yes and no. I'd love to imagine that I was strategic and indeed smart enough to predict exactly what's happening now with AI and where it might go. And I'm neither of those two things. But I think the book is relevant and has been relevant probably for 2 decades. Such is the state of the agency marketplace and the lack of power that a lot of agency leaders feel. But I think particularly now, and I do speak to AI in the book, of course, but the democratization of capabilities that AI is creating in the agency space, I think that's one factor that makes this book timely, like particularly timely. I think the other one is, again, very AI related. It's the decimation of the billable hour. There's just no way that we as an industry, clients and agencies alike, are going to continue to be able to make the majority of the money by selling time. It's just not going to be an inputs-based model. So I think the industry really is on the edge of a precipice, and it's a kind of dramatic, metaphor. But I think it's a precipice to something better. I think agencies can't just, keep re-articulating category truths like, oh, we're different, we insert brands into culture, or, we're different, we help ambitious clients create an unfair share of attention. They're nice lines, but to imagine that they're genuinely differentiating is just not true. It's very easy to find versions of that. And as I say, I think that's probably been an issue for 20 or 30 years. The problem we're facing now is that the nature of differentiation, given the democratization of tools and capabilities, I think agencies are going to need to think much more deeply about what genuinely makes their organization different.
No, I'd like to just dive into that a little bit more. But before so, I just want to take a quote from the book. You say the agency market isn't oversupplied, it's under-differentiated. Now, I know you've been saying that quite a bit. Now, in all fairness, you talk about the last 2 decades, and it's not been easy for agencies over the last 2 decades. And I don't think that we necessarily have to itemize why. I mean, AI is just only the last differentiator. But the relationships between clients and agencies have certainly been changing, and the expectations are changing, and so on. So if if you say, you make it sound so simple that the whole point is to be a market of one by better differentiating yourself. And everyone's claiming to be different. Where do you begin? What's the process?
So I think in the first instance, it's a mindset shift as much as anything else. So that point about the agency market sort of not being oversupplied like everybody says it is. There's a really important point in there where I would argue that the notion of oversupply in the market is really problematic for a couple of reasons. So for one, yes, there are a lot of agencies, but it's only really a problem if they all say the same thing. So the idea that all agencies are inextricably the same, it's really just sort of procurement propaganda. And I don't mean that to be, pejorative about procurement. I think as an industry, we're foolishly pejorative about procurement. They're just trying to do a good job, and so are we. But I think the idea that sort of everything's out of our hands as agency leaders, and that clients hold all the cards, and it's just the kind of cost of doing business, and we better chop our rates because someone else down the road is going to do it for less. Those are the features of an oversupplied market where you have no strength, no negotiating hand as an agency. Whereas I think if you start to think about the marketplace as being under differentiated, then it doesn't really matter how many agencies are out there, because as long as you're offering something genuinely different, you can start to be the author of your own story. You can start to create some scarcity in what you do, and you can start to leverage that scarcity. And I think once you're perceived as being genuinely different, then you can go to market differently, you can sell differently, you can productize differently, and ultimately you can price differently, which is what allows you to command a premium. And I think if you don't do it in that order, making more money as an agency in the modern world is increasingly difficult. So I think it probably does start, to answer your question, with that mindset shift and recognizing that actually you have far more power and ability, to sort of determine your own future as an agency leader than perhaps many think they do. And that's why that phrase is so important to, the book, and it's so important to the work we do at Codefinery.
It doesn't sound that different from the advice to brands in how you better differentiate yourself and also be able to command a higher price. But you talk about the sea of sameness. Can you give an example, a good recognizable example of someone who's been an agency that might have done the work, changed the mindset, and come out as now being perceived as quite different?
Let me give you a couple of examples. Well, let me start outside of the
Mhm.
agency industry for the simple reason that once you start talking about agencies, everyone's got a point of view about those.
Yes, yes.
And there's a couple of nuances there already where I think if you judge an agency by looking at its website or listening to the word on the street, it's a bit like judging a house by looking through the keyhole. You can't really tell how healthy an agency is by looking at it from the outside. And equally, some agencies are not dramatically differentiated, but actually succeed in the market. Now, you could argue they're succeeding in spite of themselves, but let me come on to that in a minute. So let me go outside the industry. As I say, I think I love the example of liquid death. So let me explain why that's helpful in this context about kind of really unpacking oversupply versus under differentiation. So if you go into any convenience store for some water, you're immediately facing, plenty of choice when it comes to bottled water. They all look the same. They're all in transparent plastic bottles. They've all got, very wholesome pictures of mountains and streams and allusions to purity. Some of them are sparkling, some of them are still, some of them are big, some of them are small, some of them are expensive, some of them are cheap. But broadly, it's literally the same product, but just packaged in ever so slightly different ways. So at that point, if you were thinking about launching a water brand, it sounds insane. It's an oversupplied market. Um, and I like to say it's a saturated market, which is a joke I repeat in the book. But the point is, it doesn't look like a particularly attractive market to go into because it's massively overstocked. But again, it's only a problem if everybody looks and sounds the same. So along come Liquid Death, and clearly they've got that sort of heavy metal, sort of energy drink aesthetic. They show up in cans rather than in plastic bottles. They've got this kind of weird and wacky kind of personality, and obviously the marketing is fantastic. They've got a brilliant backstory, which is very environmentally sound. That's all great, but it's still basically the same product. It's just water at the end of the day. So in the same way, I don't think anybody would generally have said, "Oh, do you know what this water market needs? It needs another new entrant." And I think it's the same with the agency market. You look at some of the most successful agencies of recent times, no one would have said in any of those markets, whether it's London or New York or wherever else, no one would have said, "Oh, do you know what we need in this market? We need another creative agency." So to answer your question about examples, I think, if you are going to be a genuinely standout agency, there's probably only a couple of ways that I can see that you can do that. If you're going to be the sort of liquid death of your space. And, it's interesting that Andy Pearson, the VP of Creative at Liquid Death, of course, is an ex-agency person. It's a nice little bow on that story. But yeah, they're a $1.4 billion brand. So how can agencies kind of jump past that point of oversupply and leverage the under differentiation? Two ways. One of them, I think, is the way that, for example, Mischief have done it very well, where they are sort of widely perceived to be an agency that is smashing it. And that can be done through the quality of the work. That can be done through, to some degree, the quality of the rhetoric, the awards, the client wins, etc. And a lot of that becomes self-sustaining. So brilliant people, super smart, great work. It's an easy argument to make that Mischief are one of the best agencies right now. The name is great. The obviously the work is strong. They can talk about being fearless. And but there's very few that can genuinely claim to be the best of the best. Yes, it's somewhat subjective, but if you ask a group of clients to the extent which they follow the agency market, it's likely that in that, certainly in New York, it's likely that Mischief's name will come up. The problem is not everybody can aspire and create, sustainably be the best of the best. And that's really where the idea of a market of one comes in. So I think as a counterpoint to that, I'd look at what somebody like Uncommon Creative Studio have done, firstly out of London, and obviously increasingly in other territories, including New York. But they genuinely offer a clear proposition which isn't just based on them being very good at what they do. So they talk about creating brands that people in the real world wished existed. Now, I think that buys them an authority and a permission to do a kind of work that other agencies don't give themselves permission to do. To the extent actually that when Uncommon are on a pitch list, and I've spoken to Niels Leonard about this, the client will demand that they do game-changing work. So I think there's a big difference between that as an agency showing up saying we work with ambitious brands, we're brilliant at what we do. Can we do some kind of something groundbreaking? And the client going, yeah, maybe. Imagine if you were only invited to come and talk to clients when there is a real change agenda, where there is a real groundswell of intent to do something interesting. And of course, you could easily put both Mischief and Uncommon on that pitch list, and who knows who might win on any given day. But I think being the best of the best is a tough fight to win, whereas being uniquely you and showing up with a point of view, that's a fight anyone can win. And that's why I believe any agency with the right commitment can create its own market of one.
That's very interesting. As I take a few notes on some of your language. You also discuss in the book building a competitive advantage without compromising on quality or racing to the bottom. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of an expression of what we've just been talking about. I don't think that if agencies continue along the path that they are currently on, that they will be in a strong position to, succeed in top line growth. Um, New business will continue to be challenging. There's a lot of agencies competing at a lower level with every sort of turn of the economic cycle. Um, Agencies will continue to overservice when they don't feel strong and confident in what they do. We're seeing fewer AOR relationships, so there's much more project-based work, and a lot of agencies are not really set up to have that kind of hunger and kind of constant commerciality to keep winning and keep growing. And obviously, that's going to hamper profits as well. So particularly, we've seen procurement as broadly have greater power. We're seeing far more incumbent repitches, which on the one hand, the incumbents are winning more often, but on the, at what cost is the broader question. If they are largely an exercise in, confirming that the client is getting full value, if you like, in inverted commas. And I think the consequences of top line growth and profit margin being challenged is, of course, that you start to have real issues around people. And without that, you've got real problems. So if a lot of your best people in your agency are massively overworked and, they become a flight risk, or, their health is at stake, you can't necessarily reward them as much as you'd like to. You can't invest in the culture around them. There's challenges in creating the kind of diverse and equitable and inclusive workforce that most agency people would aspire to working within. So I think when you don't have a differentiated position in the market and you don't have the ability to consistently thrive, by which I mean bringing in good clients, having great relationships, producing work that, brings in more clients and all the while getting paid, a sensible value for the work that you've delivered. If you can't make all that stuff happen, then, the risk is that you are in that race to the bottom where, as a lot of agencies are, you're just trying to kill what you eat, or eat what you kill, rather. You're chasing around trying to find the next paycheck, and you taking on work which is, even not quite in your sweet spot, but doesn't really help you promote the kind of business you want to be. And of course, you end up with, basically we'll do work for money, and that's no business strategy at all. And I think there's a real deficit, frankly, in a lot of agencies in and around the vision of the business. Where are we going? Why does it matter? And how are we going to get there? And for me, those are fundamental building blocks of business strategy that a lot of agencies, don't do well enough.
No, that's fascinating. I think you've just revealed, the core aspect of the book there in three phrases. And we should just I'd like to continue with that, but I have one quick question. Do you think it's harder then for network agencies to be able to differentiate than it is for independents?
It's so interesting because I get this a lot. People say, well, what kind of agencies does Codefinery advise? And if it's, people might say, oh, is it big agencies? Is it small agencies? Is it, is it about ownership models, as you sort of allude to? Is it geographical? Is it about agency discipline? It's none of those things. It's just, interestingly, there's a bit in the book towards the end where sort of talking about what's in the way of creating a market of one, sort of working through the various common objections. And there's two that come up a lot. One of them is, we're too big to make this work. And the other one is we're too small to make this work. And it's remarkable how each kind of group, if you like, cutting along the lines of scale, will imagine that it's them that's on the wrong side of that ability. And I think it's just a reflection of this absence of autonomy and self-determination in the marketplace. We're too big because insert five reasons. We're too small because insert five reasons. I think the scenarios are different. Obviously, the scale is larger. I think if you were going to go down a certain route of specialization as a very large agency, that's harder to do because, you might need to trim out more of your existing clients. You might need to trim out more of your capabilities. But I think this is one of the big reframes in the book is that really what we're talking about here is that specialization and business strategy are effectively the same thing. If you're not specialized in something, then you don't really have much of a robust business strategy. And the problem with that is that when I mention the word specialize, if I'm on stage at a conference in front of a bunch of agencies, a lot of the people in that audience, often the majority of that audience, will hear the word specialize and think, oh, well, that just means one discipline, or it means, oh, it must mean a single vertical sector. And it absolutely could mean those things. And to the point about scale, if you're small, it is very easy to make it mean those things. But it doesn't have to mean those things. So I would argue that the big holding companies are very specialized, even though that they have all the disciplines and all of the geographies. But the reality is that if you're a global, client and you need effectively a one-stop shop for all of the stuff, then there's only, four or maybe three soon places you can really go. And that's very specialized. So I think once we broaden out that definition of specialization, it kind of opens up a different conversation about, how to go about creating differentiation in the way we're talking about. And, that conversation
Yeah.
can play out if you're a big agency or a small one.
It's interesting because specialization is kind of through the lens of needs and capabilities almost, as opposed to a definition of what is a particular discipline. Um,
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a big distinction here between your positioning as an agency and your value proposition. And I think we conflate that in our industry a lot. It's very easy to, again, this is our terminology, and I'm not saying that this is the one true faith, but I
mhm.
think unless we're clear about how we mean these words, then they get very kind of blurry very quickly. So in codefinery language, we talk about positioning as being simply the business that you're in. So, a holding company, that's a positioning. I know what that is as a client. I don't need to think about it. Ad agency is a positioning. Teacher, lawyer, tax advisor,
Media
artist,
agency. Yeah, yeah.
media agency, exactly, CRM agency, Amazon marketplace
Right.
specialist agency. It doesn't matter how granular you go, as long as you're very clear about what it is. Now, for me, your positioning, it's not there to sell to clients, it's just there to orient them. So, for the same reason that if I said I was a lawyer to you, that could mean 101 different things. I could be a family lawyer and that could be extremely relevant to you, or I could be a corporate lawyer and you'd have no interest.
Right.
And so it goes on. So I think once you sort of get the ballpark clear in the mind of your target audience with a simple positioning statement, it's you cease to feel the need to have a value proposition that has to reinvent the wheel. So the sort of examples I gave earlier about I can't remember what I said now, but it's I don't know, creating, inserting brands into culture. That's not a bad sort of value proposition. It doesn't really have an audience definition in it, but at least it speaks to some kind of audience outcome. I think when we blur the two, we get nonsense like being, we're the human ingenuity agency or nonsense like that, which means nothing. So there's a piece in the book where I talk about symptoms of meh and kind of a sort of 6 or 7 examples of where agencies tie themselves up in knots, conflating words like positioning and proposition, and end up with kind of word soup that doesn't really make an awful lot of sense.
No, you
So
make you make a lot of sense because words are pretty powerful, particularly when you redefine them in a way that makes things clear and helps people understand not only what you're saying, but what you're standing for. And I think that in a business of pretty words and catchy phrases, that becomes very difficult to often get to that point of clarity. You've mentioned scale a couple of times, and I know that in
mm,
the book you also challenge the idea of scale for scale's sake. What's a better way for agencies to think about ambition or to think about growth?
I think this is such an interesting question because I think the ultimate answer is just to slow down and listen for what you actually want. I think it's that kind of classic thing where, if you're an entrepreneur and you haven't got $10, you're going to want to make 1 million. Yeah, great, let's make 1 million. And then of course you make your first million and then it's like, yeah, let's make five. And then you make five. It's no, I want to make 50. So it's almost like, you can go through your life sort of assuming that the thing you think you want or never really slow down to sense check is the thing you want. And then of course you wake up and, a lot of time has passed and maybe that's not what you wanted at all. I'm not saying it isn't, but I think COVID has one of the interesting legacies of COVID is that I've seen a lot of agency leaders since then think very differently about what growth means to them. So I think historically, a lot of founders sort of thought about growth in terms of, financial growth. You want to hit X number of million, or it might be headcount growth. It is pretty high level stuff. It's not even necessarily profit growth. Whereas actually, I think now that notion of growth is perhaps a little bit broader. It's more about personal growth. It's more about the life I want to have. That might be about the joy of doing the work you want to do rather than just definitely heading towards some significant, exit. And there's nothing wrong with money and there's nothing wrong with going for a big exit, but actually there's just a richness there which is more interesting to some people. It might be that growth means leaving on time for you. It might be tucking in your kids in bed every night. I think the same thing in the kind of corporate world and the larger holding company agencies, for example. And again, we're talking about the polar ends of the market and there's a lot in between. But I think a lot of people after COVID and increasingly so are recognizing that having taken that corporate path, which I stepped out of, the job security there and the sacrifices you make, there's a lot of travel, there's a lot of, intensity. That job security is a bit of a myth now. So is that still what you want? So I think with any of this stuff, whether it's money or you want a sort of work-life blend, it's, you want to tailor your life for joy and fulfillment. They're all good things, but I think we have to be very, very intentional about what it is that each of us as individuals want, because otherwise the risk is we do a thing and it doesn't make us happy. So it's like if you don't have a very clear destination in life or in work, then you might not like where you end up. So I would encourage anybody that's in the agency business, particularly if you have some authority and some responsibility for other people, is to just slow down and think, is this what I want? Is it really what I want? And it's, that's when, so you find something you really love and you're motivated for, you never work a day in your life. And that's a joyful existence I would recommend for everybody.
Well, I think that most people aspire to that, but I also think that, saying no is very difficult when you're on that treadmill. Let me ask you something maybe a little bit more philosophical. If more agencies took your advice and adopted the market of one mindset, how do you think the industry would evolve?
Um,
You
I,
laugh. Well, that might be a good thing.
I think it'd absolutely be a good thing. As I say, it's, I mean, again, when people like the sort of philosophical jousting part of this, it's like, well, hang on a minute. Are there enough markets of one to go round? What if everybody had a market of one? Then everybody's different. What would happen then? And it's like, fine, we can engage with that. The reality is that not every agency will do this. And there is an enormous amount of money to go around as well. So I don't think there's only a finite number of agencies that can do this. But I think if we, as you say, sort of zoom out and think about this philosophically,